What's up everyone, it's Carrington, and in today's short video, I'll be explaining the differences between evil and sin, because while the two are absolutely connected, there is definitely a difference between those two, and it is absolutely imperative that we clarify that difference in today's world where most Christians do not understand the contrast between the old covenant and the new covenant. Sin is a legal classification dealing with God's law. Evil is a moral classification dealing with whether the action is good or not. Before I get into explaining what all of this means, a concept I want you guys to start putting in your mind is kind of contemplate the difference between the law of gravity and the law of aerodynamics. And I'll get back to that in a second. When we read the Genesis account, we see that Adam was given instructions, he disobeyed those instructions, and he was therefore kicked out of God's presence. And God said that he died when he was kicked out of God's presence, which is very funny enough, the very same mirror that we see when Israel is exiled out of God's presence from the land of Israel into Babylon. And God said that they died at that point, and then they would be resurrected when they were brought into that presence. Anyways, understand that sin is connected to death, and death is connected to being in the presence of God. 1 Corinthians 15 says, "The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law." So death, sin, and the law are connected. And it's very important to understand that sin is a legal classification, because we, again, go into passages like Job, and we see that there is an accuser looking and nitpicking to see if humans have upheld God's law and standard, which obviously we couldn't have done. Nobody has been able to do except Jesus. And that brings us to the most important fact is, again, we've gone through an entire history of people missing God's law and going into Sheol, which is where we get Sheol, Hades, the grave. And up into Jesus, Satan held the keys of death and Hades, the Sheol. Why? Because at the end of the day, his judgments, his accusations on whether somebody followed God's law or not were correct. However, the point is, Jesus, the perfect man, was killed. And that was God's trap that he set for Satan. Because no longer could Satan's judgments be correct, because now the death of whom he had control and the keys over took an innocent man. And that's exactly why Sheol could not hold Jesus. And we read that not only did Jesus descend into Hades, he took the keys of death and the grave. That then therefore nullifies this law of sin and death. We're no longer bound by gravity, the law of sin and death. We are now flying aerodynamically. Shout out to my dad for this analogy. We are flying aerodynamically in the law of grace, in the law of love. But however, that does not mean that evil does not exist anymore. If we read Revelation, it says outside the gates, this is talking about the New Jerusalem, after the New Jerusalem has dropped on the earth, which a lot of people think is physical. In the new heavens and new earth, outside of the gates of New Jerusalem, it says outside of the city gates are the dogs, the sorcerers, the sexual immoral persons, the murderers, the idolaters, and everyone who loves and practices lying. Sounds like evil to me. Sounds like exactly what we see in today's world to me. However, the legal classification of sin is no longer applicable. Now what is left is evil. What is evil or what is good? And again, I want to stress to you guys the fact that the legal classification of sin is no more, because again, we are no longer bound by the law of sin and death. Again, what does the Bible say in 1 Corinthians 15? Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? If you guys read 1 Corinthians 15, you'll see that it talks about those who are asleep and who are waiting to be resurrected, those who are in Sheol, and then those who are living who would not ever have to sleep and go into Sheol and would be changed at the blink of an eye, at a twinkling of an eye, I think is what it says. We have to understand what death the Bible is talking about and how death is connected to sin. And once we understand how death is connected to sin, it's easy to see how the classification of sin does not exist anymore, because we are not under that law. We're not under that set of governance. We are under the law of love. And that does not mean that we do not disobey God. However, we have the imputed righteousness of Christ. We are wearing Christ's righteousness as if it were a robe, as if it was Esau's clothes put on Jacob to receive something that he did not deserve. And that's exactly what the imputed righteousness of Christ is, even though we still disobey in our attempts, in our pursuit of doing better and following him. It's not considered or classified as sin anymore. And this is very important in today's world now following God. It's important because a lot of people use this terminology of sin and they kind of beat down in their own heads that they're sinners. However, the point is that God wants an innocent, spotless bride. The whole point of the end of Revelation is bringing us back to the garden, back to that innocence. If your mind is continually telling you, when you have the imputed righteousness of Christ, that you are still a sinner and that you are dirty and that God, whatever your brain wants to tell you, but specifically that you are a sinner and that you continue to sin and continue to persist in this, you are doing yourself a disservice and you are going to continue to find yourself in the same spiritual rut because you're not understanding the imputed righteousness of Christ completely cleanses the conscience of any guilt. And it brings us back to the garden of pure innocence. And that's what God wants from his bride. And so there is a difference between sin and evil. Evil still exists after sin was destroyed, when the law was destroyed. But we have to understand that there is a difference and we cannot conflate the two terms. There is a difference, guys. Anyways, that's the video. Till next time.